A teoria dos antigos astronautas diz que seres extraterrestres estiveram na antiguidade no nosso planeta, nos ajudando de alguma forma, alterando geneticamente os seres humanos para que se evoluísse mais rápido. Mas também há pesquisadores que dizem que eles criaram portais, rituais xamânicos para atrair esses seres ao nosso planeta, abrir esses portais para que possamos atravessá-lo, ir até eles e eles virem até nós. Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite, boa madrugada, aonde você estiver. Eu sou o THIAGO. Sejam todos muito bem-vindos ao canal Desvendando Mistérios. O meu entrevistado de hoje é um pesquisador britânico, figurinha carimbada na série Alienígenas do Passado. Estou falando de Andrew Collins. Mas antes da gente começar essa entrevista enorme, fantástica e importantíssima, não se esqueça de se inscrever no canal. Marque também o sininho, para sempre que tiver um vídeo novo, você não perder nada e ficar sempre atualizado das novidades. Deixe também um like em todos os vídeos do canal e comente cada um desses vídeos. Além do que, compartilhe esse vídeo e o canal para que possamos crescer cada vez mais. Andrew é um escritor de ciência e história que desde 1995 investiga as origens da civilização humana. Ele é o co-descobridor de um enorme complexo de cavernas sob o Planalto de Gizeh, hoje conhecido como Caverna de Collins. Autor de vários livros, incluindo Getaway to Atlantis, The Search for the Source of the Lost Civilization, Göbekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods e Temple of the Watchers and Discoveries of Eden. Ele participou de vários episódios da série Alienígenas do Passado. A sua pesquisa, muito dela é voltada para o xamanismo e explora a sua origem e também como os nossos ancestrais usavam rituais xamânicos em locais sagrados para criar portais de comunicação com inteligências não humanas. Vamos falar também sobre contatos com ultraterrestres e a possibilidade de seres multidimensionais. Qual a conexão moderna entre a natureza e o que nossos ancestrais viram no passado? E hoje aqui comigo nós temos um dos maiores pesquisadores ufológicos do mundo. Figurinha carimbada na série Alienígenas do Passado, além de outras participações em vários programas do Discovery, do History e tantos outros, além de palestrante internacional. Andrew Collins é um escritor de ciência e história que investiga as origens da civilização humana desde 1995. Ele é co-descobridor de um enorme complexo de cavernas sob o Planalto de Gizeh, conhecido como Caverna de Collins. Autor de vários livros, incluindo Getaway to Atlantis, The Search for the Source of the Lost Civilization, Göbekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods, The Temple of the Watchers and the Discovery of the Eden, Origins of the Gods, Contact with Transdimensional Intelligence, From the Ashes to the Angels, The Forbidden Legacy of a Fallen Race e Atlantis in Caribbean. Esses são só alguns dos 15 livros que ele já publicou. Ele participou de vários episódios da série Alienígenas do Passado, como eu já disse, e hoje ele vive em Essex, na Inglaterra. Vou trazer para nós o meu amigo Andrew Collins. Hello, Andrew. Thank you very much for being here. Welcome.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I look forward to a lively chat.
And I love the accent, the British accent. I lost my accent, but I love it. I love it. My friend, I'm going to start with the same question that I make to all of my guests in my YouTube channel. Why did you become interested in researching the origins of the civilization? And how does this connect with the ancient astronaut theory?
Okay, well, for me, it began really with an interest in UFOs when I was very young. I mean, I was actually quite interested in aircraft, and you know, I followed them. I went to airports, I collected numbers, and did what you do when you're a kid. And then one day, I actually saw some kind of strange light crossing the sky, and I couldn't understand what it was. You know, I thought, well, how am I going to write this up? You know, what do I put? You know, I've seen a UFO, and it perplexed me to such a degree that I started thinking, well, you know, forget aircraft, let's start looking at UFOs. So I started to read pulp paperbacks on the UFO subject by people like Brad Steiger, John Keel, Brinsley Le Trench, a famous English author, Raymond Drake. And, you know, this obviously introduced me to UFO encounters all the way around the world. But it also started to make me realize that this wasn't a phenomena that began in 1947 with the Kenneth Arnold case in the Cascade Mountains of Washington, you know, or anything else that was going on around 1947, just after the Second World War, that this was a phenomena that had been around, you know, for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But it was then that I read a book which changed everything, and that was Eric von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods, because what he suggested in this book, which originally came out in 1968 and was a huge hit worldwide, obviously in the early 1970s, is that perhaps these aliens, if you like, you know, obviously as to what they are, that's a matter we can discuss, have been interacting with humankind, and that they may well have contributed to the rise of civilization. So in other words, when you look at monuments like the Great Pyramid, Stonehenge in England, the Nazca Lines in Peru, and obviously many other similar sites, was there some kind of influence in these constructions that came from an extraterrestrial source? So that's the link between the two. In other words, are the intelligences associated with UFOs today, have they been around and have they helped the rise of human civilization? So that's the link. That's the premise that I started to work with a long time ago. And what became my focus of interest is that if the answer is yes, then what are these intelligences? Can I get closer to them? Can I actually get to the point where I can actually talk to them myself and try and find out more about them? And for me, this opportunity really came in early 1978 when I was investigating Britain's first ever UFO abduction case involving a car with a family of 5 that were driving along a road on a short journey, and they encountered an object that passed overhead, and then the car headlights failed, the engine failed, they could no longer hear the tires of the vehicle going over the road, and they turned a bend in the road and came across a luminous bank of green mist. And they went into this and everything stopped. They felt very nauseous, and the next thing they know, they were 3/4 of a mile further on, about a kilometre further on. And when they got home, they realised that 3 hours were missing from their life. And cut a long story short, they contacted me eventually, and I interviewed them, found that they were very reliable people, and I got a London hypnotist involved to take back the man of the house, his name is John Day, to this experience, and an onboard experience was revealed. And there were entities on there, very tall entities that were called the Watchers, and very small entities, like almost like these strange dwarf-like creatures as well, that were like medical operators. And you know, this was essentially it. Now, all of this conformed very nicely to UFO lore as it had come to be in the late 1970s. However, it was quite clear that there was something deeper, because John Day felt that at night he could astrally project out of his body and go into the center of some kind of collective mind and talk to this intelligence. And also we found that in hypnosis, he could fall into a trance and a voice would come through that would claim to be this particular intelligence. And it would reveal information about their technology, about their home planet and things like this. And once again, this all conformed very nicely to UFO lore. But what I was beginning to realize is that it was a lot more complicated than simply the idea of nuts and bolts spacecraft coming here from another star system and arriving on Earth and helping humanity. It was far, far more complex. And books by the likes of Jacques Vallée and John Keel were telling me this, that we could be dealing with intelligences that were ultra-terrestrial. In other words, that they came from somewhere that was outside of the Earth, but not necessarily from another star system. So I started to look very closely at, you know, what might be going on and why this family lost 3 hours of their life and why it happened instantaneously. And I tell you for why, because the family had 3 children, and in the car, as they entered into the mist, 2 of the children were asleep and a third one was awake, standing up with his hands on the passenger and driver's seat. And when they came out of this experience, seemingly after they'd spent 3 hours on a UFO, all the children were in exactly the same position. The 2 children were asleep. The third one was still standing up with his hands. And you think, you know, is it possible that the aliens put everybody back in the right position and somehow made 2 of the children fall asleep and they, you know, positioned them correctly, you know, or was it possible that these people lost the 3 hours instantaneously? In other words, they were taken out of what you might refer to as normal space time, and they entered into some kind of parallel realm, a realm which I began to refer to as a bubble universe, something that would open up and they could enter inside and experience on a physical level or on some level that was meaningful and real to them. And they could communicate with an intelligence that was real. There's no question that it was a real intelligence, but that in many ways what they were seeing is almost what the intelligence wanted them to see and what humanity expects to see under such circumstances. And, you know, I started to realize that we could be dealing with extra dimensions of space. In other words, that under certain conditions, when you enter into these type of environments, you know, where you have, let's say, luminous banks of mist, you actually enter into a realm that has an additional area of space. In other words, 4 dimensions of space instead of 3. And this started to make me think that we could be dealing with not so much extraterrestrials, or not primarily at that, but we could be dealing with transdimensional or interdimensional, whatever term you want to use, beings and intelligences that have been interacting with us for many, many thousands of years. That's not to say that the Earth has not been visited by physical beings. I believe that this is going on all the time, but that where they come from is something a lot more complicated than what we have been led to believe. And that it could well be that these environments, which often involve objects of light or environments of light, which are known as plasma, act as conduits or interfaces between our 3D reality, our 3-dimensional reality in which we live, and higher dimensional realms that coexist with us or allow access to parallel worlds where other intelligences exist, physical, but perhaps with their own laws of physics, and that under certain circumstances, these 2 worlds can, you know, overlap, and that under certain conditions, seemingly under the production of plasma, which is the so-called 4th state of matter, that this allows almost like a doorway, gateway or portal to open between this world and other worlds. an interaction, an overlap can actually take place. And I think that when this does occur, you know, not only can entities, beings, you know, quite literally come from there to here, but also structured craft can manifest out of this light. You know, in other words, you know, you're dealing almost with wormholes, that the creation of the mouth of a wormhole, that one mouth is here and the other mouth is somewhere else, whether that's in a parallel world, that could even be another star system, it could even be a multi-dimensional environment. All these become possible if you start looking at the UFO phenomena as slightly more exotic than what most people have seen to this day. I can't hear you.
Sorry. It's a recorder, we can cut it off.
Okay, but you got all of that, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Getting the idea about the unscientific astronaut theory, why do you assert that the modern unscientific astronaut theory started in century 17? You asserted in an interview that the modern unscientific astronaut theory started way before the 17th century. Why is that?
Well, I mean, I think the 17th century is too modern. You know, to start off with, you have megalithic sites all over the world, literally, but obviously many of them in this country, like Stonehenge, the huge stone circle complex of Avebury, Newgrange in Ireland, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of these megalithic sites. And many of them cluster around not only places of intense geology involving fault lines, but also locations that are well known for the appearance of UFOs. I mean, for instance, Stonehenge, you know, over the centuries, there have been dozens, if not hundreds, of accounts of mysterious lights and other strange objects and strange beings, light beings, appear in the vicinity of Stonehenge. Nearby, Avebury is also somewhere that's known to produce not only weird lights, but also structured craft, strange beings, and encounters, incredibly weird encounters, which have not only been going on in the modern era, but certainly go back as far as records is concerned to the 17th century. But it becomes apparent that the people that actually made these monuments, these stone circles, standing stones, barrows, long barrows, etc., were aware that these areas where they constructed these monuments were obviously somewhere where there was an interface, an interaction between this world and the next. In other words, they too were seeing the same phenomena that we see today. Because the reason why intense geology is important, and when I say geology, I'm talking about fault lines under the ground, I'm talking about tectonic plates, I'm talking about different types of minerals that produce electricity, such as quartz and tourmaline, for instance, and also metals such as iron, copper, mercury. All of these seem to be components associated with geological landscapes where mysterious lights, UFOs, strange entities, light beings will appear on a regular basis. And I believe that the reason for this is that the geology creates environments where these manifestations can open up. In other words, they are portals. Some people would call them UFO hotspots. And at such locations, this phenomena is going on not just today, but historically. You will often find, for instance, particularly in Europe, in Britain, for instance, where I live, is that you'll find that in these areas you have folklore and legends connected with the fairies, you know, the little people who are said to have manifested as light in the past. I mean, encounters that go back certainly to medieval times, you will also find that these locations are connected with the appearance of gods associated with lightning and thunder. And of course, obviously, we know that lightning is associated with the spherical phenomenon known as ball lightning. So in other words, you're dealing with, the appearance of balls of light and other types of objects of plasma, which have been present for hundreds and thousands of years. And I mean, people might say, well, look, what are weird lights to do with UFOs and structured craft? Well, the answer is that most UFO encounters begin with the appearance of light. I would say possibly, as far as true close encounters are concerned, where objects, are seen in close proximity, perhaps 50, maybe even 70% of them begin with the manifestation of light and then something emerging out of that light. Well, to me, these lights are manifestations of plasma. That's essentially what's going on here. And plasma itself is known as the fourth state of matter. What it manifests through intense environments where you have a lot of naturally generated electricity underground that's generated by the intense pressures of rock. And what happens is that when these pressures occur, they force atoms to release electrons. They're tiny particles of that come away from atoms, and they flow. And when they flow, they create electricity. But these free electrons, which are also known as negative ions, will rise out of the ground, rise up, and create these whole, what science refers to as ionic or ionospheric environments. And these are environments that are ripe for the manifestation of plasma, because plasma is something when a lot of these electrons come together, they have around them self-generated magnetic fields, and suddenly they burst into light. And the reason why they burst into light is because these electrons become so excited that they release photons of light. Now, these are very tiny packets or particles of light. And when this occurs, and it's like an action that is perpetuate, continues on, you get balls of light or objects of light appear. Now, these can be very small. They can appear for a microsecond. They can appear probably for an hour, and they can be any size. And they will quite literally burst into existence and be present. But what's so important is that many of these plasma objects, or plasmoids as they're called, will be intelligent. Those that encounter them will not only see them as acting and moving intelligently, but these objects will be able to interact with the human mind. In other words, when we see them, the objects will often stop and start moving towards people as if they are either intelligent in their own right or intelligently controlled. And of course, we're talking about UFOs here, and often they will be seen to transform into structured craft. And it's almost as if the structured craft either manifest from the plasma objects, or plasma acts as a conduit or a portal through which objects and beings can actually manifest. But of course, this is something that happens more easily in areas where you have a very intense geology, involving fault lines, certain types of mineral that produce electricity, like quartz and tourmaline, obviously silica as well. And also, as I said, places where iron ore or copper ore or whatever are present within the earth, because they more easily allow the electrons to travel through the earth itself. So you have these intense environments. And if you look at these areas, you'll find that humanity has been connected with them for thousands of years. As I said, in Britain, in Europe, you have the stone circles, the megalithic monuments. But of course, in other countries, you have temples and structures, religious places. There seem to be sacred places in Native American tradition, for instance, where it's known that you can interact with other worlds, you can interact with the beings that exist and come from those other worlds. And it's important for us to look at this phenomena not as purely technological, that has been present with us since the Roswell crash in 1947. You know, that gives us a false impression that everything is to do with nuts and bolts and flesh and blood. And that is not the case. Yes, you might be dealing with biological entities, but those biological entities are entering into our realm more obviously through portals that open up temporarily and allow such creatures, such entities to manifest in our physical reality.
You got a very, very interesting point, because in your book, Origins of the Gods, you explore the shamanism. What is the origin of the shamanism is it connected with the UFO phenomena?
Yes, I mean, shamanism is where certain talented individuals within a community have the ability to enter into a trance and connect with what they believe to be the other world or parallel realms that coexist with us. And the reason for this is to communicate with the intelligences that exist within these parallel realms. Now, these intelligences can take on any form, and that will depend upon the particular cultural upbringing or religious upbringing of the people concerned, the particular community, the particular society. I mean, it could be as simple as seeing the animals that they've killed in a hunt. In other words, you know, beings that take the form of animals that can transform into humans, like, for instance, in Native American tradition, in Siberian tradition, Mongolian tradition. But in other cases, these beings can look more obviously strange. Like in Native American tradition, they have a belief in what's known as the blue beings. The blue beings are these small human anthropomorphic beings that, you know, when described, would be quite similar to those of the greys of modern day existence. And there are certain locations where these shamans will go to make this connection, and they will be able to communicate with them and gain otherworldly information and knowledge, which they will then bring back to their community. And this will help that particular community evolve, to advance, accelerate in its own evolution. And this is something that I think has been going on for not just thousands of years, but possibly hundreds of thousands of years. I say this because the oldest form of shamanism has recently been discovered in a cave in Israel, just outside of Tel Aviv. And this is at a site known as the Kezem Cave. And here, human beings, very similar to ourselves, existed from around 400,000 years ago down to 200,000 years ago in an age known as the Lower Paleolithic. And the people here had become the most advanced in the whole of this part of the world. I mean, arguably even in the world. They were making so many advances, you know, for humanity there, that you have to start asking what was going on. Well, the fact that they also invented shamanism, and this comes in the form of a swan wing bone that was discovered that had been not only stripped of its feathers, but modified, in other words, cleaned and used for ritual purposes, probably to be held in the hand by the shaman during rituals. And this would have allowed the shaman to enter into an altered state, possibly with other types of things in, you know, creating that altered state, maybe even hallucinogens, and being able to project their mind into the parallel realms, and connecting with the ancestors. But what they were also doing is creating the earliest crystal balls in the world in the form of these balls that were multifaceted. Some were flint, some were made of a hard limestone. So these were held in the hand and used as mental focuses. But on top of this, the stone materials that they were collecting to make their tools, you know, whether these be projectile points or whether they be, you know, used to scrape the skins of animals or whatever, were coming from a mountain close by known as Mount Gerizim. And Mount Gerizim is somewhere that, if you read the book of Genesis, you will know is the mountain of God. It was seen to be the gateway to paradise, or the gateway to heaven, where God would manifest in the form of something known as the Shekinah. The Shekinah means the presence of God. And usually it's associated with manifestations of light. If you think of the story of Moses, for instance, climbing Mount Sinai, where he encounters God as this sort of like blinding light, well, that's the Shekinah of God. So in other words, God would appear on Mount Gerizim in the form of light. And if you start looking closer at Mount Gerizim, you'll find that historically this was associated with the manifestation of mysterious objects of light, and also in more modern times it's connected with the appearance of what you might call flying saucers or UFOs. And I actually went to Mount Gerizim to try and, you know, get to the bottom of this and find out whether these lights were still seen to this day. And on the top of the mountain is a whole community of people known as the Samaritans. Now, these people believe that they are the true descendants of the original Israelites that entered the promised land with Joshua shortly after the time of the Exodus and the 40 years that the Israelites spent in the wilderness. And the first place that they went to was Mount Gerizim. And these people basically claim that their ancestors, you know, that they are the descendants of these original Israelites. So I went to the top of the mountain and I asked the highest ranking priest that I could find, you know, what about these lights? You know, are these objects still seen today? And he said, yes, they are, absolutely. And I said, well, you know, how are they interpreted? And he said, Malakim. And this is a word that means angels. So this means that to this day, these lights that are manifesting on Mount Gerizim are interpreted as the messengers of God, as angels, which in many ways is very poetic and very much in line with the whole ancient astronauts idea, you know, that in ancient times that you know, light beings, ETs or whatever, would be seen as angels. And so when you go back to the people of the Kezem cave, is it possible that they were accelerating very fast in their evolution because they were interacting with this phenomena and the intelligences involved, possibly even light beings, as much as 400,000 years ago? And I mean, this I think is very, very important to understand that, you know, we're dealing with a phenomena that's not just been around for a few thousand years, but has been around, well, since forever. You know, not only 400,000 years, but we have to start looking back to the origins of humanity itself on the Great Rift Valley in Central Africa, you know, where the earliest hominids rose up to create the earliest stone tools, the most beautiful multifaceted tools, perhaps as early as 1.75 million years ago. And, you know, you have to say to yourself, where did this information come from? You know, because prior to this time, the only stone tools that they made were just getting river pebbles and just smashing them and using sharpened pieces to cut and you know, to do whatever they were doing with them. And yet then suddenly we start making the most beautiful stone tools, known as Acheulean hand axes. And we would then continue to make these hand axes almost in an identical form right the way through until about 200,000 years ago. And is it possible that the intense geology of the Great Rift Valley of Africa was affecting the intense geology through the electromagnetic fields, the appearance of plasma, the interaction with these geomagnetic, energies that were affecting the human brain. All of this was evolving us into who we are today, and that a part of this was interaction with these very same intelligences that remain with us today and we call extraterrestrials.
That's great. It's amazing and very, very curious as well. But Andrew, how did our ancestors use shamanic rituals in sacred places to create communication portals with the non-human intelligence?
Well, I mean, firstly, we have to look at it from the modern day. There are UFO hotspots around the world, and there are scientific work going on at these locations. And very often, the scientific teams involved with them will actually bring in shamans to perform rituals to try and bring the lights or the objects, the UFOs, close. And this actually works. I mean, for instance, at Skinwalker Ranch, they've brought in Navajo and Ute shamans onto the ranch, and to try and call in the intelligences involved with UFOs, and manifestations of light have actually occurred. The same thing has taken place, for instance, at Martha in Texas. This is somewhere where mysterious lights appear almost on a nightly basis, and sometimes those mysterious lights can take the form of structured craft and act in an intelligent manner, showing that they themselves are beings, light beings in their own right. And these shamans have been brought in again for this purpose. So if we know that the shamans can do it in the modern day, it's very obvious that this has been going on for thousands of years, right the way through to the time of the Kezem cave in what is today modern day Israel. That the shamans, one of the reasons why the shamans came into existence was that they were the standout individuals of a community that could make this connection between this world and the next. Yes, they would obviously dress themselves in certain types of paraphernalia, usually to do with particular animals or birds, and because they would believe that they could take this form to transfer the mind from this world to the next and back again. In other words, that they could more easily communicate with these intelligences if they were able to travel in the form of an animal or a bird and communicate with what they would have perceived as their ancestors. Because that's the other thing is, today we see these intelligences as aliens and extraterrestrials, and indeed some of them probably are from other star systems. I mean, we could never discount this. But in the past, the ancients would not have seen them this way. They would have seen them in terms which would have been familiar to their own particular tribes or societies or communities. So they would probably have seen them as their ancestors. They would have seen them as, gods, even, goddesses, whatever. In other words, some kind of higher being that could help them with the progression and the acceleration of their own evolution. And of course, from this, you start to get the stories of the gods and our interactions with them. You start to get the stories of the Anunnaki and the Watchers of the Book of Enoch, and various of these different types of higher dimensional or higher intelligences and our interaction with them. And you have to remember that always we will interpret the nature of these beings in terms of cultural standpoints. In other words, what we'd call acceptance levels of existence. And in other words, if we, in the modern day, since 1947, or certainly since the Second World War, we look in terms of the space race, rockets and things like this, and our own achievements of going to the moon or to Mars or sending probes out as the, you know, other intelligence. We mirror that in the phenomena that we see. In other words, we assume that it's other civilizations doing exactly the same. And once again, I have to stress that almost certainly we have been visited on many occasions by extraterrestrial civilizations, whether it's as probes, whether it's as, you know, physical craft that have beings in them. I mean, there are tons of different stories from all the way around the world, from North America to the South Seas of the Pacific, that actually do talk about objects that come down and beings coming out of them and interacting in some way with the human communities and then going back into those objects and taking off. You cannot deny this. I mean, obviously, this is what people like Erich von Däniken have tried to get across in their books. And Carl Sagan, the great cosmologist in the early 1960s, looked at this subject and he concluded that the Earth has been visited on countless occasions by extraterrestrials and that we should be aware of this. Unfortunately, what happened with Carl Sagan is that once he started working with NASA, they told him to stop this. You know, you have to stop talking about aliens and UFOs if you want to work with us. You know, you can write your fictional books like Contact that, you know, talk in terms of communication with higher intelligences and how they may have transmitted technologies to us, but, you know, do not talk about this publicly. So this particular paper, scientific paper that Carl Sagan wrote back in the early 1960s has only really recently resurfaced. But he obviously believed this. And if Carl Sagan believed this, and this was long before Erich von Däniken wrote Chariots of the Gods, then quite clearly, who am I to you know, deny this? And I believe that it is a very strong possibility. But the importance here is, what was the impact of these visitations? Was it you know, extraterrestrials that were simply, you know, coming here on a one-off basis? Were they killed when they arrived? You know, what went on? You know, was this a mistake, or was it something more long and protracted? Was there an impact on humanity? Well, to be honest, as a writer of ancient civilizations, the origins of humanity, I have not found enough evidence that has convinced me that physical aliens have contributed massively to the rise of civilization. What I have found, and what I do believe, is that interactions from these higher intelligences have affected us through here, through the brain, through quantum entanglement. The idea of communication through telepathy and mind over matter may well have influenced our development in civilization. And this is something, as I said, has probably been going on not just for a few thousand years since the beginning of civilization, but since the beginning of humanity and our first construction and creation of the earliest stone tools, possibly as early as 1.75 million years ago.
And another very interesting aspect of your research is about the contacts with the ultra-terrestrials. Who are they, and how was human progress affected by contact with the ultra-terrestrial and the possibility even multi-dimensional intelligences?
Well, ultra-terrestrials is a term that was coined in the 1960s by the American writer and UFO researcher John Keel. And what he realized is that the term extraterrestrial or even alien was inadequate to describe some of the strange beings, creatures, and anthropomorphic, people that were turning up at UFO hotspots, like, for instance, Point Pleasant in Virginia, which included the manifestation of these winged creatures who come to be known as Mothman. And Mothman appeared regularly to individual witnesses in the area of Point Pleasant, and they were like these huge 7 or 8 feet tall, human-like creatures with these wings, and they would frighten the hell out of people. They appeared to people driving in cars. They would appear at windows, and what happened was that at the same time, UFOs and mystery lights were being seen in the same area, and you had these strange individuals turning up, that claimed and would contact him and claim to be extraterrestrials, like Ingrid Cold was one of them, and they would be like feeding him information and would seemingly know exactly what he was doing at any particular time. So he was looking at all of this and realizing that it was all part of a much bigger picture. And so he started to refer to all of these individual intelligences, whether they be, creatures, humans, aliens, objects, Mothman, as ultra-terrestrials. He believed that that was a much better term to use. But of course, you can extend it out from this, even into Brazil, where you have the Virginia case from 1996. A lot of people see that the creatures that were manifesting there at this time as perhaps escaped from a crashed UFO that obviously was also seen at the time. But this is not necessarily the case. The creatures that were seen at Virginia, for instance, could have come through portals, because we know that at the time that all of this took place in 1996, there were many UFO sightings occurring, days, if not weeks, before the appearance of the object on January the 20th that was seen by the 3 youths, the 3 girls. And it was obviously seen at various other locations directly after that, and in fact, obviously there were more than one being. Now, people, if they are looking at things in terms of pure nuts and bolts spacecraft, will say, well, yeah, obviously they escaped from some kind of craft and they may well have been piloting that craft. But I don't necessarily think that we have to see it that way. What's possible here is that that a portal opened and that they came through either temporarily and went back to where they came from, or there's the possibility, if some of them did indeed die here, that they couldn't get back. They could no longer go back through that portal. So they were trapped in our physical reality. And that the fact that there may have been a UFO crash at the same time could really simply be just a synchronicity. In other words, something that contributed to the story simply because it occurred at this time. But as I said, these type of beings have been appearing all over the world. We call them, humanoids, occupants, entities, and they are physical. They can leave traces. They can even be, Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever. I mean, not all Bigfoot and Sasquatch are necessarily, creatures that have survived in very wild, remote environments for, thousands, if not millions of years. They could easily be coming through portals and be creatures out of normal time and space. They could temporarily exist in this world before returning back from whence they come. I mean, Bigfoot, for instance, is often associated with the manifestation of lights and UFOs. This has been repeatedly reported, for not just a few decades, but seemingly for centuries. And often you'll find that some of these creatures, you'll find footprints that suddenly just stop and go nowhere, as if the creature has disappeared into nowhere. Well, what I think is going on is that those creatures are going back to wherever it is that they've come from, a parallel world that has been overlaying, interacting with our own, that suddenly the access between the 2 points starts to move away, and at such times it pulls these creatures back from whence they came. I mean, in the UK where I live, I've investigated cases of out of place animals, like big cats, like panthers, black panthers. And what you find is that these creatures will appear frequently for a period of maybe 2 to 3 weeks. And, you know, they'll be seen out in the wild, even in urban streets. And then suddenly they'll vanish and they'll never be seen again. Or certainly not for, you know, many years, maybe decades later. And then just suddenly they'll reappear again. And you have to say to yourself, clearly you're not dealing with physical creatures that are just hiding away, particularly as often searches go on to try and find these creatures or evidence of them. And yes, at the time, you might find footprints. You may even be able to find, you know, hairs, pieces of fur. But then suddenly they just vanish away and no trace of them is ever seen. And sometimes these creatures appear on small islands which quite clearly could not sustain colonies of these creatures over a long period of time. I mean, at the southern part of England, there is a place called the Isle of Wight. And I investigated cases of big cats there, 3 different types of big cats: black panthers, pumas, which are brown, and lynxes, which are, you know, multicolored, like light and dark at the same time. Now, you're telling me that there are colonies of these creatures living on the Isle of Wight and nobody sees them for years, decades, and then suddenly they're all there and then suddenly they disappear again. Clearly, this is not the case. Clearly, they are or are likely to be manifesting from parallel worlds. The other important thing is that sometimes these big cats appear at localities where we know that in the Paleolithic era, there were also big cats. One example of that is in Somerset, near the town of Glastonbury, a well-known sacred centre where mysterious lights, objects, UFOs are seen on a regular basis. Big cat was seen locally, and what I found is that almost at the exact spot where this big cat was seen, and, you know, comes back occasionally, the bones of exactly the same animal were found that had lived perhaps 15 to 20,000 years ago. And it's one of the few places in Britain where this animal is known to have thrived at that time. So is it possible sometimes that these animals are going through portals from one period of time into our, you know, our timeline, and then they have to go back to where they came? And if this is the case, then clearly many of these entities are coming from parallel worlds through portals, most obviously using plasma environments. In other words, these manifestations of plasma objects, or these mists that are like luminous, electrified, luminous mists that will appear. And, you know, to be honest, you know, don't go near them. If you ever see one, don't go into it unless you want to lose a lot of time and maybe even never come back, because all the evidence seems to suggest that they will cause time slips, or time storms is the term that my colleague Jenny Randalls, for instance, used for what happens to people when you go into them. She wrote a whole book called Time Storms, which I would definitely advise, you know, the viewers to check out. One of the very important books on this subject.
To finish our interview, we stopped to watch the sky. The skies. It's true. It's a reality. How our modern disconnection from the nature and the lack of a fully visible night skies make the manifestations of this extraterrestrial intelligence seem random, and how we could reconnect with the nature and the skies?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a good point. Obviously, today, if we go outside, I mean, I live in an urban environment. If I go outside, I can't see the Milky Way. I can't see most stars. And to be honest, I sort of rarely look at the celestial bodies unless I'm in the open countryside. And that's a shame, because it is an example of disconnection. And obviously we're in concrete environments where our feet do not touch the ground. You know, we obviously wear shoes and boots, which disconnect us with the very subtle geomagnetic energies that permeate the landscape. So, you know, we have to try and consciously reconnect. And the way that I would suggest to do that is to go and find your sacred places, go and find megalithic sites in Britain. Obviously, we're talking stone circles like Avebury and the area around Stonehenge, or any other stone circle at any part of the country. It's almost like you plugging in to an electrical system, and somehow this brings you alive. It makes you start to see the world differently. And it's no coincidence, I think, that these same areas are UFO hotspots. I mean, if you're in Britain, for instance, I would advise going to Avebury. Nearby is a place called Alton Barnes. And this is the centre of crop circles, which appear every year in the fields of England. And often these crop circles are associated with mysterious lights, with feeling of energies, with healing, effects on electrical equipment, and the sighting of light beings and other mysterious objects. So you can have those experiences yourself in the modern day. You can put yourself in places where it's much more likely that these experiences will occur. Check out the local folklore, find out if, you know, in the past, light beings have been seen, like fairies and, you know, other forms, angels appearing. You know, in other words, lights and objects and beings that have been interpreted to do with the cultural references of a particular era. And I mean, obviously, every site has portals. Every country in the world has portals and, you know, and UFO hotspots. I mean, you know, they're there in Brazil. They're obviously there in North America with places like Skinwalker Ranch. And, you know, they're there in every other country. You have to seek them out. And quite clearly, you do this by checking online or connecting with UFO researchers, paranormal researchers, Earth mysteries researchers, and just getting a feel of what connection you want to make. And of course, there are groups that you can join, or societies or conferences that you can attend. In Britain, for instance, there is Megalithomania in May each year. We have our own conference called Origins, or go on to Gaia TV. This is a streaming platform that is global, and this is full of hundreds and thousands of different programs from free thinkers like myself. I mean, I'm on Gaia TV, on Ancient Civilizations, Deep Space, and other shows. And, you know, we're trying to bring these ideas to a greater audience. I'm also on Ancient Aliens. I help to, you know, to structure some of the episodes that you see, bringing all of these ideas together. Because, as I said, if you start to see UFOs as purely nuts and bolts, and the entities that are associated with them as purely flesh and blood, you miss out on the possibility of the connection with intelligences that are multidimensional, exotic, and have been with us for many thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. You can still make that link. You can still have these encounters. And these encounters, if you have one, will change your life. You'll become incredibly creative, maybe musical, maybe a writer, a poet, you know, a sculptor. You find that this happens again and again. And even if you don't have the UFO encounters yourself, you know, you'll be able to feel the energies at these sites. You'll feel a certain state of transformation. You know, do meditations, do visualizations, reach out with your mind to try and call the intelligences to you. I mean, they need us because, you know, we have two arms and legs. We can do, you know, the groundwork for them. We can create crop circles, you know, in the landscape, which act as signs of transformation. You know, we can investigate these places. We can keep alive these energies. And I think that this is really important for us to do. And, you know, obviously, shows like your own are only helping for all of this to take place.
Well, Andrew, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and your research. We could spend 5 hours, 6 hours, 10 hours talking about your research. Would like to say a last thing to our audience. Please be my guest.
Okay. Well, if you're interested in what I've said, I've got a website, andrewcollins.com. There's loads of stuff on there. We do tours to Turkey to see places like Göbekli Tepe and other beautiful places that are as much as 11,500 years old. We go to Egypt. We're going there in November. And, you know, go onto the Megalithomania website. There's various different tours there around Britain and other countries. And obviously my books, I've written at least 15, maybe even 20 books these days, on all of these subjects that make us challenge the way that people tell us about the past and our interaction with, other intelligences, whether it be God, whether it be angels, whether it be extraterrestrials, or anything else. We need to better understand them. And obviously look out for me on Ancient Aliens and other similar programs where we try and bring some of these subjects to you, not just in the most obvious ways of disclosure and, US Congress hearings about UFO, being seen by the US Navy or whatever. That's one part of all this, but it's not the personal side of it, your personal transformation, which you can do by getting involved yourself.
One of my goals is make a travel with you. I will do that. Well, yeah, I'm gonna leave all the links for your website and to buy your books, because I think that have a lot of information. Just like you said, it's not the physical, it's not the audience in Senate. It's just a part. You have to try to understand the whole scenario, and your research is very, very important for that. So thank you very much one more time.
Thank you. It is my pleasure.
Bem, pessoal, foi isso, essa entrevista com Andrew Collins. Muita informação interessante, muita informação que eu tenho certeza que vocês ficaram curiosos. Então vou deixar aqui na descrição do vídeo, vou deixar aqui todos os links, o link do site do Andrew e também de como adquirir os livros dele. Vale a pena. E essa entrevista, como todas as outras, você só encontra aqui no canal Desvendando Mistérios, entrevistas inéditas e exclusivas. Espero que tenham gostado. Não se esqueçam de se inscrever no canal, marcar o sininho, dar um like, comentar e compartilhar o canal. Um abraço e até a próxima.